Origin, motivation, consequence, and legacy of the Atlantic trade of black slaves to America. Let's explore the Atlantic slave trade step by step. Its origin, motivations, consequences, and lasting legacy. Many historians have spoken about the African slave trade, which took place in Europe and then in the New World, known today as America. This is the place where all the European colonies, English, Spanish, Portuguese, and other nations, were established. They exploited the new, fertile lands of the New World, where slave labor was needed to cultivate the land. From here comes the question we will try to answer in this work. What was the origin of slavery before and after the 16th century? Was there any type of slavery in Africa before the discovery of America? Did any type of slavery exist among the different tribal groups of the native population in America before the arrival of the European conquerors? Number 1. To start this work, let's talk a little about the origin of the Atlantic slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade, also called the transatlantic slave trade, began in the 15th century and lasted until the 19th century. It was one of the largest and most brutal forced migrations in human history. Let's talk about the background. It started when Portuguese and Spanish explorers began sailing along the West African coast in the mid-1400s. At first, Europeans traded for gold, ivory, and spices, but soon they realized that enslaved Africans could be sold profitably in their colonies in the Americas. By the early 1500s, Africans were being shipped across the Atlantic to work in the Caribbean, Brazil, and later North America. Early justifications. Europeans claimed that Africans were heathens who could be enslaved under Christian law. Others justified it economically, claiming it was necessary to build the colonies. African rulers and merchants were sometimes involved by selling prisoners of war or rival groups to European traders in exchange for guns, alcohol, and manufactured goods. This became a global system linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas, known as the triangular trade. Number 2. Let's try to analyze the following topic to understand what we are talking about the motivations behind the trade. Let's talk about the motivation. The main driver was profit. European colonizers needed massive labor forces to produce sugar, cotton, tobacco, coffee, and rice on plantations in the New World. Indigenous populations in the Americas had been devastated by disease and warfare, so Africans were targeted as a replacement labor source. Slave labor became the economic foundation of the Atlantic world, enriching European empires and building early global capitalism. Now let's talk about the political and imperial competition. European powers, Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, competed to dominate trade routes and colonies. Controlling the slave trade meant controlling wealth and global power. Let's analyze the ideology. To justify the inhumanity of slavery, Europeans developed the idea of racial hierarchy, claiming that Africans were naturally suited for hard labor. Over time, these ideas hardened into scientific racism, used to legitimize both slavery and colonial rule. Number 3. Now let's try to go deeper into the next topic to understand what we are talking about: consequences of the Atlantic slave trade. For Africa, between 12 and 15 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands. Millions more died during capture, transport, or the brutal Middle Passage. African societies suffered population loss, warfare, and economic destabilization. Some regions became militarized or depopulated. Others were politically divided by the slave trade. The focus on slave trading undermined local industries and long-term development. For the Americas, the enslaved Africans brought with them agricultural skills, languages, music, and spiritual traditions that deeply shaped American cultures. Their forced labor built the wealth of colonies and eventually the United States, laying the foundation for Western economic power. But it also created societies defined by racial inequality, segregation, and systemic violence. Let's talk about some of the motivations by European nations and merchants became incredibly wealthy. Profits from slavery helped fund the Industrial Revolution, banking systems, shipping industries, and urban growth. This wealth strengthened European empires, but it was built on exploitation and suffering. Number 3. Now let's try to go deeper into the next topic to understand what we are talking about: consequences of the Atlantic slave trade. A. For Africa. Between 12 and 15 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands. Millions more died during capture, transport, or the brutal Middle Passage. African societies suffered population loss, warfare, and economic destabilization. Some regions became militarized or depopulated. Others were politically divided by the slave trade. The focus on slave trading undermined local industries and long-term development. B. For the Americas. The enslaved Africans brought with them agricultural skills, languages, music, and spiritual traditions that deeply shaped American cultures. Their forced labor built the wealth of colonies and eventually the United States, laying the foundation for Western economic power. But it also created societies defined by racial inequality, segregation, and systemic violence. C. For Europe. European nations and merchants became incredibly wealthy. Profits from slavery helped fund the Industrial Revolution, banking systems, shipping industries, and urban growth. This wealth strengthened European empires, but it was built on exploitation and suffering. Number 4. From my point of view, we cannot stop talking about this topic about the legacy of the slave trade. A. Racial inequality and structural racism. The false ideas used to justify slavery, that some races were inferior, survived long after abolition. These ideas became embedded in laws, institutions, and social attitudes, shaping racism, segregation, and discrimination that persist today. B. Cultural legacy. Despite unimaginable suffering, enslaved Africans preserved and transformed their cultures. African rhythms and spirituality influenced music, jazz, blues, reggae, samba. Food, language, and art in the Americas still reflect African roots. The African diaspora created new hybrid cultures that are now central to the identity of the Americas. C. Economic disparities. Nations and families that profited from slavery accumulated generational wealth. Meanwhile, African and Afro-descendant communities were left impoverished or marginalized, a gap that still shapes global inequality. D. Moral and historical reckoning. Today, there are global calls for reparations, historical justice, and education about the true impact of slavery. The memory of the Atlantic slave trade continues to influence discussions about race, identity, and human rights worldwide. Number 5. Let's try to round off what was said above to continue talking about transatlantic trade from Africa to America. Aspect, description, origin, 15th century European expansion along Africa's coast, demand for labor in the Americas. Motivation, economic profit, empire building, racial ideology, and global trade control. Consequences, depopulation of Africa, economic gain for Europe, creation of racially stratified societies in the Americas. Legacy, racism, inequality, cultural fusion, calls for justice and remembrance. The Atlantic slave trade was not just an economic system. It was a turning point in human history that reshaped continents, created global racial hierarchies, and left a legacy that the world still grapples with today. Of course, let's continue with the next and final major chapter, the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade, the struggles involved, and the long-term global impact of its end. #6. Let's continue analyzing also about the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the world began to witness the slow dismantling of the transatlantic slave system. This process was not quick or easy. It involved moral awakening, political struggle, rebellion, and enormous resistance from those who profited from slavery. A. Moral and intellectual awakening. Several ideas and movements began to challenge the moral foundation of slavery. 1. The Enlightenment. 18th century European philosophers and writers began to emphasize human rights, liberty, and equality. However, many Enlightenment thinkers were still hypocritically silent on slavery or defended it. 2. Religious movements. Christian groups, especially Quakers, became early abolitionists. They preached that slavery was incompatible with Christian values of love and human dignity. Later, other denominations joined, forming powerful moral campaigns. 3. Rise of humanitarianism. Books, pamphlets, and testimonies by enslaved people exposed the brutality of slavery, moving public opinion. The famous image of the Brooks slave ship, showing Africans packed tightly in chains, became a rallying symbol for abolitionists. Number 8. Conclusion: the human cost and the unfinished legacy. The Atlantic slave trade was not merely a chapter of history. It was a system that reshaped the modern world. It connected continents, created vast wealth, and imposed racial hierarchies that still influence global society. It destroyed millions of lives, but also gave birth to new cultural identities and movements for freedom. It exposed the contradiction between Western ideals of liberty and the reality of exploitation. Its abolition proved that human systems of oppression, no matter how powerful, can be challenged, but also that justice requires more than laws. It requires memory, truth, and repair. Certainly, let's continue with the next essential section: how the legacy of the Atlantic slave trade continues to shape modern societies, influencing race relations, inequality, identity, and global consciousness today. Number 9. Something we must accept is talking about the impact the modern legacy of the Atlantic slave trade. Even though the Atlantic slave trade ended more than a century ago, its social, economic, and psychological consequences still shape the world. Its effects are visible in racial hierarchies, global inequality, cultural identity, and the struggle for justice and recognition across continents. A. Economic inequality and development gaps. The profits from slavery were one of the major foundations of modern Western capitalism. Wealth accumulated in Europe and North America was directly linked to the unpaid labor of enslaved Africans. Ports and industries in places like Liverpool, Bristol, Nantes, Lisbon, and Boston grew rich on slave trade profits. Banks and insurance companies financed voyages, plantations, and slave markets, and some of those institutions still exist today. Meanwhile, Africa suffered enormous population loss and underdevelopment because millions of its people, especially the young and strong, were taken away. This imbalance created a global economic divide that remains visible today. The richest nations often coincide with former colonial powers, and the poorest with regions devastated by slavery and colonial exploitation. B. Racism and the invention of racial hierarchies. To justify slavery, European powers developed a racial ideology that claimed Africans were naturally inferior. This ideology did not disappear after abolition. It became embedded in laws, science, education, and culture. Pseudoscientific racism in the 19th and early 20th centuries reinforced white superiority myths. Segregation, colonialism, and apartheid were built on the same logic that once justified slavery. Even today, systemic racism continues through unequal access to education, housing, healthcare, and political power. The idea of race, created largely to defend slavery, became a global social reality that still shapes how people see themselves and others. C. Cultural identity and the African diaspora. Despite centuries of oppression, enslaved Africans and their descendants preserved, transformed, and shared their cultural heritage. This resilience gave rise to one of the most powerful global phenomena: the African diaspora identity. Across the Americas and beyond, African traditions merged with European and indigenous elements to form new hybrid cultures. Music, from blues and gospel to jazz, reggae, samba, salsa, and hip-hop. These genres express both the pain and creativity of a people who turned suffering into art. Religion and spirituality. African deities and rituals adapted into new forms like Vodou, Haiti, Candomblé, Brazil, and Santeria, Cuba. Language. Creole languages blended African syntax with European vocabulary, creating new linguistic bridges. Resistance culture. Through art, poetry, and storytelling, Afro-descendants affirmed their humanity and dignity. Today, the African diaspora connects millions worldwide through shared memory, struggle, and pride. D. Psychological and social trauma. Slavery left deep psychological scars that passed from generation to generation, a concept sometimes referred to as intergenerational or historical trauma. Families were separated for centuries, erasing ancestry and roots. Many descendants still struggle with questions of identity, belonging, and recognition. Societies built on slavery often carry unspoken guilt, denial, or resentment, making racial reconciliation difficult. The trauma is not only personal but collective. It shaped national psyches, especially in countries like the United States, Brazil, and Caribbean nations. Education, memory, and historical silence. For centuries, history books written by colonial powers minimized or distorted the story of slavery. Enslaved people were often described as property, not as humans with agency, culture, and resistance. In recent decades, historians, artists, and activists have fought to recover these voices. Museums and memorials now exist in places like Senegal's Gorée Island, Ghana's Cape Coast Castle, and the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. Literature, film, and scholarship increasingly center Black experiences and perspectives once erased from mainstream history. However, in many countries, the history of slavery is still undertaught or sanitized, which delays the process of understanding and healing. Movements for racial justice and reparations. Modern movements like civil rights in the U.S., Black Lives Matter, and Pan-Africanism all draw strength from the unfinished struggle that began with the fight against slavery. They demand equal rights and protection under the law, recognition of systemic racism's historical roots, reparations, financial or institutional compensation for the wealth stolen through slavery. Some nations and universities have started to acknowledge their historical complicity by creating scholarships, memorials, or apology statements, but comprehensive reparative action is still debated. Global awareness and the struggle for truth. The legacy of the Atlantic slave trade is no longer confined to history books. It has become a living conversation about justice, memory, and humanity. UNESCO's Slave Route Project works to promote global education about slavery's history. The Caribbean community, CARICOM, has formally demanded reparations from former colonial powers. Many countries now mark remembrance days to honor enslaved Africans and their descendants. This growing awareness reflects a collective desire to confront a painful past rather than bury it, to build a future based on understanding, equality, and truth. 10. Conclusion: a legacy still unfolding. The Atlantic slave trade was not only a system of forced labor, it was a system of dehumanization that reshaped the modern world. Its legacy lives on in every aspect of global society, in the wealth of nations and the poverty of others, in the cultural creativity of the African diaspora, in the racial tensions and inequalities that still divide communities, and in the moral call to remember, repair, and reconcile. Understanding this history is not about guilt, it is about truth. It is about recognizing how the past built the present, and how knowledge can heal what silence has long denied. The Atlantic slave trade remains one of humanity's greatest tragedies, but the story of its survivors and their descendants is also one of endurance, transformation, and hope. Through memory, art, and resistance, they continue to redefine freedom for all of humanity.